The courtroom was jammed like a late-night Waffle House after a football game. Sweaty, tense, and buzzing with that quiet, southern kind of chaos where everybody pretends to be polite while sharpening knives under the table. Imani Brooks stood dead center, solo, at the plaintiff's table. Her heels, locked to the floor like roots, a thick motion in one hand and a pen like a sword in the other. Her posture calm but locked in, because she knew what this was, knew exactly what she was walking into. And she dressed for war, not court. She wasn't just any attorney. She was young, sharp as a switchblade, black, and Harvard-educated. And around here, that last part hit like a punchline. People didn't think she earned, especially in a courthouse where the paint was peeling and the justice was just for show. Judge Walter Dandridge, sitting high on that elevated bench, oozed that smug kind of arrogance that didn't need to yell to make you feel small. White, gray-haired, well-fed on privilege, the kind of man who still called it the good old days, when no black woman would have dared talk in his courtroom, let alone challenge his authority. He barely let her finish her second sentence before cutting her off, not even pretending to hide the irritation in his voice, like her presence was a personal inconvenience. Like he was swatting at a fly instead of hearing a civil rights case that had the potential to tear holes in the thin blue wall. "Now wait a minute, Miss Brooks, is it?" he said, mispronouncing it twice, even though it was printed clearly on the front page of her motion, and then smiled, like he was doing her a favor by pretending to care. "We don't get Harvard types down here often, unless they're lost, that is." The gallery let out a soft, mean laugh. The kind of laugh that isn't about humor. It's about reminding people who's supposed to have the mic, and who's supposed to just sit down and smile while being stepped on. Imani didn't laugh, didn't smile, didn't react at all, really. She just kept her eyes locked on him like she was studying rot beneath the surface of something that used to be solid. The kind of rot you don't fix with words, but with demolition. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to clap back loud, or throw legal jargon like darts. She just said it, slow and clear, and cool enough to chill the whole damn room. "I'm exactly where I need to be." For a second, nobody said anything. No one even breathed, like the room itself had leaned in, confused about how someone could take that kind of disrespect and hand it back wrapped in dignity. That silence, that moment right there, it wasn't surrender. It was the eye of the storm, the quiet heartbeat before everything explodes. The beat drop no one saw coming. What no one in that room realized, not the gallery, not the smug-ass judge, not even the clerk watching nervously from the corner, was that this wasn't just a hearing. It was the beginning of an earthquake. And Imani, standing there with her papers and her calm eyes and that unshakable presence, wasn't just arguing emotion. She was flipping a switch. And when that switch went off, the whole system was going to feel the jolt. Judge Dandridge wasn't letting up. In fact, he was just getting warmed up, leaning back in his big leather chair like it was a throne and she was some jester who'd wandered in off the street with a degree she didn't earn. "We don't do Yankee theatrics down here, Miss Brooks," he drawled, with that slow, sticky tone only people who think they're untouchable use. "This is a courtroom, not a Broadway audition." And the gallery let out another round of forced laughter that sounded a whole lot like fear pretending to be funny. He was talking over her, cutting her off, waving his hand like she was an annoying commercial, interrupting his favorite show, trying to shrink her down with every insult, every dismissive glance. But she didn't shrink, didn't break, didn't even blink. Instead, Imani stood taller, her voice smooth and steady, and what came next wasn't an argument. It was a demolition. Paragraph by paragraph, case by case, she started laying out her motion with surgical precision, the kind of courtroom work that doesn't scream, it slices. She quoted the Constitution like scripture, cited Supreme Court rulings like receipts, and then she pulled out the real twist. A quote from one of his own past rulings, a dusty little opinion from 2009, where he waxed poetic about due process and officer accountability, which she turned right back on him like a boomerang. "In your own words, Your Honor," she said, cool and deadly, "the integrity of the court is only preserved when even those in uniform are held to the law, not above it." And for the first time all morning, his mouth stopped moving. The smirk that had been plastered on his face, like a smug mask, started to twitch, then fade, as the realization hit him. She wasn't some kid playing dress-up. She was the storm knocking at his door, and she'd come armed. And just when the room thought she might be done, that maybe she'd just come to drop a little heat and leave, she pulled out the file. A sealed record, newly unsealed, verified and time-stamped, detailing the internal investigation that never saw the light of day, and pointed right to the name in black ink. His nephew, Officer Reed Dandridge, accused of doctoring reports, suppressing evidence, and leading a cover-up tied directly to her client's case of police abuse. It didn't happen all at once, but more like a ripple, like the air had changed. 1 second, the courtroom was cocky and dismissive. And the next, the entire back row of journalists leaned forward at the same time, like bloodhounds catching the scent of a story that could break a city. One of the court clerks, young, nervous, and way too caffeinated, fumbled her pen, and it clattered to the ground way louder than it should have, like even gravity wanted to underline what had just dropped in the room. Judge Dandridge, now visibly sweating under his powdered wig of authority, tried to get control back, his voice climbing an octave as he snapped, "Miss Brooks, I don't think you understand that—" But she cut him off, not with disrespect, not with volume, but with the kind of legal command that makes even marble statues sit up straighter. "Your Honor," she said, cool and crisp, eyes locked and voice steady as a loaded gun, "I suggest you recuse yourself immediately before this court's integrity is further compromised." And the room sucked in breath like they'd just seen a queen slap a king on his own throne. And then, oh then, Imani reached into her folder like it was a magician's hat and pulled out a crisp, tabbed, and time-stamped document. An emergency motion for judicial review, already filed and processed, signed not just by her, but co-signed by the Southern Legal Coalition, the National Civil Rights Bar, and 2 former federal judges. Basically, the Avengers of courtroom accountability. The timing wasn't luck. It was surgical. A perfectly aimed strike designed to detonate exactly at the moment Dandridge lost control of the narrative. And as she handed the document to the clerk, you could feel the entire courtroom flip on its axis. And in that instant, every doubter in the room, the ones who side-eyed her suit, who chuckled at her opening statement, who assumed she was just some intern playing dress-up, realized they'd been baited into a trap, because Imani Brooks wasn't just in the courtroom to argue. She was there to flip the damn system upside down. And she wasn't some junior associate fumbling for a win. She was lead counsel, and this courtroom, it was hers now. It didn't even take an hour before the courthouse started buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. First, a few murmurs, then a cascade of phones lighting up, and by lunchtime, the whole damn building was whispering versions of the same question. Did you hear what she just did to Dandridge? Reporters from local stations were already filing out of the gallery to hit send, tweets flying faster than court transcripts. And, within 30 minutes, it was live on every feed from Baton Rouge to D.C. Judge Walter Dandridge accused of presiding over a case that implicates his own family in a cover-up. Down in the cafeteria, clerks stared at screens with wide eyes, passing phones back and forth while trying to act like they weren't losing their minds. And upstairs, attorneys were pulling clients out of rooms just to catch the moment unfold in real time. By midday, it was no longer just courthouse drama. It was national. The Judicial Oversight Committee had been pinged, and a federal observer had already been dispatched to assess the situation, which is government speak for "watch this dinosaur get cooked." Dandridge, now red-faced and visibly unraveling behind the bench, tried to play it cool, but the shift in power was radioactive, and even his voice cracked when he tried to regain control of the room. He was cornered, and he knew it. The evidence was bulletproof. His nephew's name was on that file in bold, and no amount of Southern charm was gonna magic that away in front of a gallery full of witnesses and cameras. The same colleagues who used to nod when he entered the room, who used to back his decisions, without a second glance, now looked down at their shoes or stared at the walls, pretending they hadn't once bragged about being on Dandridge's side of justice. He reached for his gavel, hand twitching like he thought maybe slamming it would reset the universe. But it looked smaller now, like a toy hammer in the hands of a man who suddenly remembered he could bleed. He cleared his throat, jaw tight, and tried for one last power move, leaning into the mic like he was still in charge and saying, "This court will recess until further." But he didn't get to finish, because Amani didn't flinch, didn't wait, didn't even raise her voice. She just interrupted him like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment and said, with steel in her spine and fire behind her calm, "Respectfully, Your Honor, this is no longer your court to recess." And right on cue, as if the universe had been waiting for the punchline, the rear doors creaked open, and in walked the presiding judge of the state's appeals circuit. Robe flowing, expression tight, holding Amani's emergency motion in one hand and the weight of authority in the other. By 3 p.m., the camera crews were practically fighting for angles as Judge Walter Dandridge, once the untouchable monarch of this courthouse, was escorted off the bench mid-session, red-faced and fumbling. The whole thing broadcast live on local television and already clipped for the internet by the time he hit the hallway. That smug little quote of his, "We don't get Harvard types down here unless they're lost," was now a viral soundbite, played over and over on loop with side-by-side footage of Amani standing tall, dropping constitutional law like it was artillery, and making the old man look like a relic that should have been retired 20 years ago. Within hours, a formal disciplinary review had been announced, emails subpoenaed, files pulled, and the walls of power he'd built out of whispers and favors started collapsing like wet drywall under pressure. And then came the real hit. The state launched a sweeping case audit of his previous rulings, hundreds of cases, some going back decades, suspicious rulings, suppressed evidence, mysteriously vanished complaints, all of it getting dragged into daylight for the first time ever. And suddenly, Dandridge wasn't just a bad judge. He was ground zero for a decades-long pattern of systemic rot. Outside the courthouse, Amani stood at a cluster of microphones with the calm of someone who didn't need to scream to make the ground shake. And when a reporter asked what justice looked like to her, she smiled, tilted her head and said, "Justice doesn't just wear a robe. Sometimes it walks in the room wearing natural curls and carrying a briefcase." Kiki. That quote hit the wires harder than a verdict. Within minutes, it was trending, posted over photos of her standing in front of the courthouse, like she owned the concrete it was built on. Shared by law students, activists, teachers, and kids who'd never seen someone like her in that kind of spotlight. Civil rights lawyers from every corner of the country started pouring into Baton Rouge. Some flying in, some calling judges they knew, some just showing up in solidarity, ready to take on whatever came next. Not for clout, but because they saw what Amani had cracked open, and they weren't about to let her fight it alone. What began as one motion, one woman, one voice, one courtroom, had become a flood, a full-blown legal and political uprising as a paper trail of ignored complaints, buried misconduct, and corrupt backroom deals started surfacing like bodies no one thought would ever float. And now, the story wasn't just about Dandridge anymore. It was about every name, every case, every hand that helped him keep the system rigged while pretending justice was blind. And every single one of them just felt the ground shift under their feet. Weeks passed, but the aftershocks didn't fade. In fact, they kept spreading from courthouse break rooms to law school classrooms. And by the time the Louisiana Bar Association formally invited Imani Brooks to headline their annual conference, they already knew it was a long shot. She sent back a polite no thank you, not out of spite, not because she didn't have something to say, but because she had bigger plans, and they didn't involve clapping for an institution that had only started listening once the walls cracked. Instead, she took that attention, the headlines, the spotlight, the inbox stacked with offers, and poured it into something that would outlast the news cycle. A nonprofit legal initiative designed to find, train, and arm the next generation of young lawyers of color in the Deep South. built not just to survive the system, but to change it from the inside out. And while cameras faded and politicians moved on to safer talking points, her client, the one whose bruises started it all, won their case. Not just on paper, but in life. Damages awarded, record cleared, dignity returned, and a quiet apology from a city too proud to say the word, but desperate to clean the blood off its hands. But even bigger than the verdict was the shift it caused. The way students started asking better questions. The way public defenders dusted off old files. The way a new wave of black and brown law students walked into their first courtroom already standing taller. Because now they had a blueprint for what power looks like when it's wielded with precision instead of privilege. And somewhere far from Baton Rouge, in a small apartment with bad Wi-Fi and chipped paint, a little girl sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, watching a shaky YouTube clip of Amani standing in front of microphones, holding her ground, hair natural and voice steady, her name now synonymous with courage in places courage used to avoid. The girl leaned toward the screen, eyes wide like she'd just spotted the future, and whispered to herself, low and certain, "I want to be like her." And no one heard it but her. But that one sentence landed heavier than any verdict, because that's how the next chapter begins. Because what Amani Brooks did that day wasn't just outmaneuver a racist judge or flip a courtroom on its head. She rewrote the damn story of who gets to belong in that room, and more importantly, who gets to rewrite it next.